The morning sun rose over the military base, casting long, golden shadows across the neatly paved streets and the rows of pristine barracks. It was a beautiful, crisp day, the kind of morning that filled a person with a natural sense of optimism and energy. Inside one of the olive-drab utility vehicles, Sergeant Carter was behind the steering wheel, his face a mask of intense concentration as he attempted to navigate the vehicle into a particularly tight parking space. In the passenger seat sat Private Gomer Pyle, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gentle concern. Gomer leaned forward slightly, squinting through the windshield at the narrow gap between the two parked cars. The space looked incredibly small, almost impossibly so, and his honest nature compelled him to speak up. He turned his head toward the senior officer, his voice carrying its usual warm, southern drawl as he expressed his doubts, stating clearly that he did not think the vehicle could make it because the space was simply too short. Sergeant Carter, however, was not a man to back down from a driving challenge, especially not in front of a subordinate. He let out a scoff, his pride slightly pricked by the suggestion, and told Pyle to watch closely so he could see exactly how a true expert accomplished the task. With a look of absolute confidence, the sergeant explained the mechanics of the maneuver, noting that first, a driver had to cut the wheel hard in one direction. He turned the steering wheel with practiced authority, guiding the heavy vehicle into the small opening. He continued his live demonstration, adding that at exactly the right moment, the driver must cut the wheel hard the other way to align everything perfectly. Just as the words left his mouth, a sharp, metallic scraping sound echoed through the quiet morning air, accompanied by a slight, sudden jolt that vibrated through the frame of the automobile. Gomer winced, his face twisting into an expression of immediate apology and concern as he realized what had happened. He looked out the window and informed the sergeant that they had just struck the vehicle parked directly ahead of them. Sergeant Carter froze, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. He turned around, his eyes flashing with disbelief and annoyance as he demanded to know what Pyle had just said. Gomer, remaining entirely polite but completely firm in his observation, repeated his statement, explaining that they had hit the car ahead of them because he had heard the impact clearly, suggesting that their own bumper must have gotten caught on the other vehicle. The sergeant, refusing to admit any mistake in his expert driving, shook his head vigorously and claimed that he had not heard anything at all. He pointed an accusing finger at Gomer, arguing that the private was simply turned around, looking into the back seat, and must be completely out of his head to imagine such a thing. He insisted with absolute certainty that he had never even touched the other automobile. Gomer, hoping to resolve the matter safely and ensure no harm had been done, asked if there was any actual damage to the vehicle. Sergeant Carter quickly glanced through the mirrors, shrugged his shoulders, and declared that there was absolutely nothing wrong, reiterating his claim that no contact had been made. He shifted the vehicle into gear, eager to put the minor incident behind them, and commanded Gomer that they should leave immediately. However, Gomer's strong sense of honesty and civic duty would not allow him to move so quickly. He called out, asking the sergeant to wait for just a minute. The sergeant sighed heavily, his impatience growing by the second, and asked what could possibly be the matter now. Gomer pointed toward the side of the parked car, noting that there was a visible scratch on the surface. The sergeant leaned over, squinting out the window, and muttered that he did not see anything at all. Gomer, determined to show the truth, adjusted his position and explained that if one leaned over in a specific direction, it could be seen perfectly from that exact angle. Upon closer inspection, the faint line on the paint became undeniable. It was indeed a scratch, small but present. Sergeant Carter frowned, realizing his perfect driving record had a tiny blemish, but he still did not think it was worth making a fuss over. Gomer looked at him with innocent, questioning eyes and asked if the sergeant was truly planning to just drive away and leave the scene. The sergeant responded with a defensive question, asking why he should not do exactly that. Gomer explained patiently that the sergeant had damaged another person's automobile, and while it was completely an accident, it was still undeniably the sergeant's fault. Carter groaned, throwing his hands up in mild frustration, and asked what Gomer expected him to do about it under the circumstances. He reasoned that if the owner of the vehicle were standing right there, he would gladly tell the man he was deeply sorry, but it was already after 6 o'clock in the evening, and he had an important dinner date with Bunny that he could not afford to be late for. Gomer's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion of leaving without a word. He reminded the sergeant that leaving the scene of an accident, no matter how minor, was legally considered a hit and run. The sergeant scoffed at the serious terminology, arguing that a tiny scratch could hardly be called a hit and run. He suggested that anyone could simply take a soft cloth and a little bit of polish and rub the mark out in a matter of seconds. Gomer shook his head gently, disagreeing with the quick fix. He explained that to truly repair a scratch like that properly, a person would have to sand the existing paint off entirely, cover the bare metal with a coat of primer, and then carefully blend some fresh new paint into the surrounding area. He estimated that it would be at least a $10 repair job. The sergeant gasped slightly at the mention of the monetary amount, repeating the sum of $10 with a look of dismay. Gomer, trying to look on the bright side of the situation, reminded him that he possessed quality automobile insurance, which ought to cover the expense completely. Carter immediately rejected the idea, stating firmly that he had no intention of filing an official insurance claim for such a trivial matter because the company would undoubtedly raise his premium rates as a result. He checked his watch anxiously, stating that he absolutely had to leave, and began to move away. Gomer remained by the parked vehicle, his expression calm and resolute. Seeing that the private was not following him, the sergeant stopped in his tracks, turned around, and asked what on earth he was doing just standing there. Gomer smiled warmly and replied that he was doing nothing at all, just waiting in place. The sergeant, remembering their earlier plans, noted that he thought Gomer was supposed to be going to see a movie. Gomer agreed that he was indeed planning to see a film, but he had decided that he would rather wait around for the gentleman who owned the damaged car to return. The sergeant's face fell as he realized the implications of Gomer's plan. He asked, with a tone of growing dread, if Gomer truly intended to wait for the stranger just to inform him that Sergeant Carter was the one responsible for the scratch on his fender. Gomer, trying to reassure his superior officer, told him not to worry at all. He generously offered to take the entirety of the blame upon himself, since he had been the one directing the vehicle into the tight space. However, he added with complete innocence that it was only fair to also inform the owner that the sergeant was the one behind the wheel. Gomer looked at him earnestly, asking if the sergeant did not agree that it was the only honorable thing to do in such a situation. He began to philosophize, stating that if more people in the world simply owned up to their own mistakes, there would not be nearly as many problems. Before Gomer could launch into a lengthy sermon about honesty, Sergeant Carter raised his hand to stop him, capitulating to the private's unwavering conscience. He muttered an agreement, stating that he would write the gentleman a note. Gomer beamed with genuine happiness, declaring that it was a wonderful decision and that he just knew the sergeant was going to feel much better inside about the whole thing. He then recalled a piece of wisdom from his family history, mentioning that it was just like Grandma Pyle used to always say, that if a person's conscience is not right, they're going to spend the night tossing and turning, but if their conscience is completely clean, they can sleep peacefully until 8:15 in the morning. Sergeant Carter quickly scribbled a message on a piece of paper, writing out his full name, his military rank, and his telephone number. He included a brief statement explaining that he would pay for the minor damage caused to the fender. He handed the slip of paper to Gomer, instructing him to place it securely on the gentleman's front window. Gomer accepted the note with enthusiasm, promising that he would do so immediately, and repeated his grandmother's rhyme about a clean conscience leading to a peaceful sleep until 8:15. The next day, Sergeant Carter was sitting at his desk in the military office, sorting through paperwork, when the telephone rang loudly. He picked up the receiver and answered with his usual professional greeting, identifying himself clearly. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Whipple, the owner of the parked car from the previous evening. The sergeant's face brightened with a sense of pride, and he acknowledged the note he had left, confirming that he was indeed the one responsible. He accepted the man's initial compliments, smiling as he remarked that while most people might have driven away without a word, he simply was not built that way. He felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that there were still good, honest men left in the world. Wanting to settle the matter quickly, the sergeant asked what the repair was going to cost. However, the response he received caused his smile to vanish instantly. Mr. Whipple began talking about obtaining multiple official repair estimates. The sergeant, confused, asked why anyone would need multiple estimates for a simple scratch. But as the voice on the other end read out the final total, Carter's eyes bulged in absolute shock. He shouted into the receiver, repeating the number $235 with utter disbelief. He demanded to know what could possibly cost that much money for a tiny scratch. Mr. Whipple insisted that there was extensive, severe structural damage to the fender. The sergeant's temper flared, and he firmly told the man that he did not know what kind of dishonest scheme was being run, but they had absolutely chosen the wrong person to deceive. He declared loudly that he had no intention of paying $235 for a minor scratch and told the man he could do whatever he liked about it before slamming the receiver down on the cradle. Later that afternoon, Gomer found the sergeant pacing back and forth in the barracks, still fuming over the phone call. When Gomer heard the staggering amount of money being demanded, he let out a soft exclamation of surprise, stating that he found it incredibly hard to believe anyone would ask for so much. The sergeant turned on him, his voice dripping with sarcasm, and remarked that of course Gomer found it hard to believe, because as far as the naive private was concerned, the entire world was just one big innocent storybook. Gomer looked down at the floor, his heart heavy with guilt, and expressed how truly sorry he was for causing such a mess. The sergeant threw his hands in the air, yelling that Gomer was always sorry, but being sorry never stopped him from doing something incredibly foolish. He lamented that while he was not foolish enough to pay such an outrageous bill, some other unsuspecting person probably would have been tricked into paying it, and the entire situation had been made possible by Gomer and his constant desire to be the nicest gentleman in the room. As the tension in the barracks hung heavy, the door suddenly opened, and a stern-looking civilian gentleman stepped inside. He looked around the room with an air of absolute determination and asked if someone could direct him to Sergeant Carter. The sergeant stepped forward, his posture rigid, and announced that he was indeed Carter, asking what he could do for the visitor. The man crossed his arms, introducing himself formally as Harry Whipple. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he realized he was standing face to face with the man from the telephone. He acknowledged the name with a sharp nod. Mr. Whipple did not waste any time with pleasantries, stating that he had one simple question to ask the sergeant, which was whether he was going to pay the repair bill or not. Sergeant Carter let out a sharp laugh, telling the man he had to be joking if he expected a payment. He marveled at the sheer audacity of the civilian coming out to a military base to make such demands after their previous conversation. Mr. Whipple's expression darkened, and he asked if the sergeant was officially refusing to pay, warning that he was prepared to take legal steps. He explained that he had wanted to give the officer one final chance to change his mind before taking further action. The sergeant stood his ground, stating fiercely that he was not changing his mind under any circumstances and told the man to get that completely straight. He accused Mr. Whipple of having a nice little fraudulent racket going, but asserted that it would never work on a seasoned Marine. Mr. Whipple stepped closer, his voice remaining level but firm, stating that he was certain the sergeant did not want any official trouble and that he personally disliked causing difficulties for a member of the armed forces, but he warned that he would not hesitate to escalate the matter. The sergeant scoffed, asking if the man was actively trying to frighten him, and told him to forget it if that was his strategy. He maintained that he had put one single, tiny scratch on the vehicle, a mark no bigger than a finger, and asserted that Mr. Whipple knew that perfectly well. Mr. Whipple, confident in his own position, challenged the sergeant to step outside to the parking lot and take a direct look at the automobile together. The sergeant readily accepted the challenge, stating that he would love to see the vehicle with his own eyes. He called out to Gomer, commanding the private to come along with them because he wanted to show him the supposed $235 Fender. Gomer quickly followed the two men outside into the bright sunlight, his mind racing with worry over how a simple scratch could have turned into such a massive dispute. They walked across the base parking lot until they came to a stop in front of Mr. Whipple's vehicle. The civilian pointed triumphantly at the side of his car, presenting the damage. Sergeant Carter took one look at the vehicle and froze, his jaw dropping in complete bewilderment. The entire side of the fender was deeply dented, crushed inward, and scraped heavily, looking as though it had been struck by a massive object. The sergeant turned around, his face pale with shock, and asked out loud who could have possibly done such terrible damage to the body of the car. Mr. Whipple looked at him with an expression of intense frustration, stating flatly that the sergeant was the one who did it. Carter immediately denied it, yelling that he had never done anything of the sort. Mr. Whipple asked rhetorically that if the sergeant didn't do it, then who else could have possibly been responsible? Before the argument could escalate any further, a woman's voice called out from inside the vehicle, demanding to know how long they were going to fool around in the parking lot. Mr. Whipple turned toward the passenger side window, pleading with his wife, Iris, to please keep her voice down and stay out of the conversation. Iris, however, was not interested in staying quiet, complaining loudly that she had an appointment at the beauty parlor that she was going to be late for. Gomer walked up to the vehicle, leaning over to inspect the mangled metal. He let out a soft whistle, remarking that it was truly the worst-looking fender he had ever seen in his entire life. Sergeant Carter turned to Gomer, desperately asking the private to explain exactly what had transpired the previous afternoon to prove his innocence. Gomer nodded eagerly, turning to Mr. Whipple to recount the events. He began by explaining that he had been heading into town to see a movie, which was supposed to be an incredibly good film about a doctor performing scientific experiments on deceased individuals. The sergeant interrupted him quickly, telling Gomer to skip the cinematic details and focus entirely on the automobile accident itself. Gomer apologized and got back on track, explaining that Sergeant Carter was carefully parking the vehicle when their bumper made contact with Mr. Whipple's car. Mr. Whipple pointed at the dent, stating that the private's testimony proved his car had been hit. But Gomer quickly clarified the situation, explaining that while the sergeant's car did indeed touch the fender, it had never caused all of that severe destruction. He testified honestly that the sergeant had only made a very little, tiny scratch on the surface. Sergeant Carter smiled broadly, gesturing toward Gomer as proof that his story was completely accurate and that the massive dent must have happened afterward. Mr. Whipple, however, refused to believe them, accusing Gomer of fabricating a phony story to protect his superior officer. Gomer looked deeply offended, defending his honesty by stating repeatedly that he was absolutely not lying. Mr. Whipple stood firm, stating that he only knew two undeniable facts, which were that he possessed a signed admission of guilt from the sergeant and a badly smashed automobile. He demanded for the very last time to know if the sergeant was going to pay for the repairs. Sergeant Carter, matched in his stubbornness, gave his final refusal, advising the civilian to get into his vehicle and leave the military base immediately before he called the military police to escort him off the property. Mr. Whipple glared at him, warning the sergeant that he was in a massive amount of trouble before getting into his car and driving away. A short time later, Sergeant Carter and Private Gomer Pyle found themselves standing inside the formal office of the base colonel. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Along with the colonel and Mr. Whipple, there were two other gentlemen present in a room, introducing themselves as Mr. Goodbody, a sharp legal attorney, and Mr. Marshall, an official insurance agent. The colonel looked at Sergeant Carter over his desk, stating that he had personally reviewed the extensive damage to the civilian's vehicle and had read the handwritten note left by the sergeant. He expressed his confusion as to why a dedicated Marine officer would refuse to take financial responsibility for an accident he had put his name to. The sergeant explained respectfully that the situation was very simple, maintaining that he did not cause the massive dent on the fender. Mr. Goodbody, the attorney, stepped forward and suggested that Private Pyle might be able to clear up the entire misunderstanding for everyone. He asked the colonel for permission to ask the private a few specific questions regarding what he had witnessed. The sergeant eagerly agreed, confident that Gomer's honest nature would vindicate him completely. The attorney turned his attention to Gomer, asking him to confirm that he was an eyewitness to the event. Gomer nodded, explaining once again about his plans to see a movie and how the sergeant had been kind enough to offer him a ride. The attorney guided him forward, asking about the nature of the parking space. Gomer described it as an awful short space, repeating the phrase to emphasize how difficult the maneuver had been. Mr. Goodbody asked Gomer to describe exactly what happened within that narrow space. Gomer explained that as they were parking, their vehicle definitely hit the other automobile, noting that there was absolutely no doubt about it because he had not only heard the impact clearly, but he had felt it as well. The attorney seized upon the statement, asking Gomer to explain exactly how it felt. Gomer, speaking from his heart, described how seeing a nice, brand new car get struck gave him a deeply sickening feeling inside, comparing it to the uneasy sensation a person gets right in their stomach whenever an automobile accident occurs. Mr. Goodbody smiled triumphantly, turning to the colonel and declaring that he rested his case, arguing that the private's own visceral reaction proved the impact was substantial. Sergeant Carter tried to protest, shouting that it was still just a minor scratch, but the colonel raised his hand to quiet the room. The commanding officer stated that he was placed in a very difficult position, with the sergeant's word against that of a respected civilian, but based on the emotional and physical evidence presented by the private, he felt there was only one honorable course of action. He ordered Sergeant Carter to pay for the damages to the vehicle in full. After leaving the office, a wave of immense guilt washed over Gomer. He realized that his honest attempt to describe his feelings had accidentally made his sergeant look entirely guilty. Determined to uncover the absolute truth and clear his commander's name, Gomer decided to visit the Whipple residence on his own time. He walked up the driveway of the suburban home just as Mrs. Iris Whipple was stepping out the front door, dressed in her fine shopping clothes. Gomer politely introduced himself, reminding her that he was the private from the military base the day before. Mrs. Whipple looked at him with an expression of pure annoyance, asking what he could possibly want from her. Gomer explained that he was looking to speak with her husband regarding the automobile accident. Mrs. Whipple dismissed him immediately, stating that her husband was at work, she knew nothing about the matter, and she was in an incredible hurry to go shopping. She told him goodbye and attempted to close the door. Gomer, refusing to give up, followed her toward her parked vehicle, asking if she could please tell him where he might be able to contact Mr. Whipple. Mrs. Whipple grew increasingly agitated, shouting that she did not have any time to waste talking to a soldier, and threatened to call the local police department if he did not stop bothering her and leave her property immediately. Gomer backed away slightly, but as he watched Mrs. Whipple get into the driver's seat of her car, something unexpected happened. She shifted the vehicle into reverse, backed down the driveway with excessive speed, and completely misjudged her steering, causing the rear bumper of the car to strike a large hardwood tree at the edge of the lawn with a loud, resounding thud. Gomer's eyes went wide as he witnessed the sudden collision. He rushed down the street toward the vehicle, asking the woman if she was completely uninjured. Mrs. Whipple stepped out of the car, her face pale and trembling with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She shouted at Gomer, asking where he had come from and demanding that he get away from her auto.